New York before he became Supreme Court judge and the prosecutor at Nuremberg. Everybody knows him. He said specifically, these are pragmatic rules, these statute of limitations. They are not fundamental rights. We need that to put it into perspective. New York needs change. Professor Lessig, who's in charge of the Ethics Center up at Harvard, has gone so far as to say New York has one of the most restrictive statutes in the nation. That is not something I'm proud of in my state. And I therefore say we should clearly extend or eliminate. I understand Professor Hamilton from Cardozo Law School was to testify, but she finds herself in court.
Mr. Miller, can
Yeah.
I stop you for just one
Sure.
moment? Because when you said that New York has the most restrictive,
Or one of them are more restrictive.
it just caused me to think
Yes.
whether you were talking about the civil side or the criminal side.
I would think both, okay? I would think both. When the Manhattan DA has to close files on cases where there may be solid leads, that's very upsetting to me. And most of my work is in the civil side. And, well, I'll get to it now. I'll say it right now, because in answer to your question, I was going to save it a little bit.
I didn't want to interrupt
No,
you.
no, that's all right. I was going to save it for my punchline, but I'll tell you, I'll do it now, since always answer the judge when he asks a question. See, I learned that years ago. And the one
My
thing I
father
can
was the
bring...
judge. I'm just an assemblyman.
Oh, no, you still make the rules. The contribution I think I can make, perhaps unique to some of the others, is as a practicing lawyer, I can tell you I get calls, I get emails, I get letters, including one this week. I'm 59. I was raped by a priest when I was a teenager. And he's got some case going, trying to get around the statute of limitations. Thank you for fighting the fight. Other people, what can you do for me? Very often I tell them I can't do anything. It's not only abuse by a priest, but sometimes school teachers and that sort of thing. What can you do? And very often I say, I look it over. I say, it's very hard, almost impossible to get around some of these statutes. So I would urge you to clearly extend, or even as Professor Hamilton, the one from Cardozo Law School, says, eliminate them. What do we need them for? As long as the evidence is good that there was sexual abuse, why should there be a statute of limitations? As already said, we want to uncover the pedophiles. And I know it's a pocketbook issue. I know that very much it's a pocketbook issue. But I would say to my friends in the church, who I know are the main opponents along with some Orthodox Jewish groups, I would say you're on the wrong moral side of this issue. I know it's a pocketbook issue. So what? You've got to vote for the predators, or you've got to vote for the victims. And I would point out that recently the Vatican extended its own statute of limitations on its time to defrock a priest guilty of that from 20 years plus the victim's 18th birthday. Now it's time for the church to go all the way.
I saw that, Mr. Miller.
Yes.
And they weren't clear in the article that I read whether it was for civil or criminal cases.
I don't think it specifies. It's within the Vatican itself, and it's just that if the priest was guilty of that, it would extend the Vatican's time to defrock the priest. It didn't go to the legal system, be it civil or criminal. It was their internal rule. But the point is, it's showing a, how can I put it, a begrudging recognition of the great harm that has been done. And now I would say to my friends in the church, you got to go all the way. You got to keep the pressure. I know the pressure is tremendous on the legislators because it's a pocketbook issue. One bishop actually said, I'll excommunicate anybody, any legislator in my district that goes for it. Really, that's an abuse of power. And it pains me to see the church on the wrong side of this issue and the other groups. And I compliment you for the courage and the wisdom that you are showing.
Thank you. Mr. Montesano.
Mr. Miller, just to ask a question.
Yes, sir.
From the lawyer's perspective.
Yeah.
While I recognize everything that's been presented, the one question I would ask, putting the financial aspect on the side for a moment.
Yeah.
If you reach back to any defendant 40 years back
Yeah.
in a situation, and it could be a school, it could be a school setting, whatever it may be, even though the plaintiff needs their day in court, how does the accused or the people they worked for or anybody related to the case going back 40 years defend their position or gather materials to defend the position?
Well, I would say the defendant has a right to take the stand. I didn't do it. This child's memory has been distorted. They have entitled to counsel of their own, who I assure you will hammer to judge and jury. It's so many years ago. Other things happened. In other words, it'll be in the ball game. But at least the alleged victim will have their day in court. They're not even getting their day in court now. But that's fair game. That sort of
Well, my
argument.
issue is not with going forward.
Yes.
I like everything going forward. My issue is reviving the old the old situations. Giving opening everything.
Yes. The window. You're right.
Where do you get documentation? Where do you get medical evidence? Where do you get reports that may have been used to prove that this person was even at a location at a particular
You may not have them. And if the plaintiff doesn't have them, the plaintiff has a weak case. Let me assure you, as one who has tried many cases before many jurors, our jurors in New York are not giveaway artists, contrary to what some people believe. And in fact, in many of our counties, the instinct is quite the other way, is quite to be a little on the careful and conservative side. And, there are some counties where that's less true. But for the most part, that is true. And the question is, are you going to have the people at least have a hearing? Because there's a lot of good in having a hearing. You may expose some pedophile that hasn't been exposed. And as Professor Hamilton has talked about, and I think, and Dr. Miller here, there's cost savings. These people who are victims, they have all kind of problems. Very often the medical costs are picked up by the state. It's time for the wrongdoers to pay for them.
Thank you.
Let me just say that a family came to see me in Albany about 2 years ago, and there was DNA evidence that existed, and they could not get a trial in New York State because of the statute of limitations. Fortunately, they took the child to, I believe, Massachusetts, and then the person was found guilty and received a life in prison sentence. But they had bloodied underwear that the young boy had hidden behind the paneling in their den. But New York State, that child, now as an adult, would not have been able to go to
The
court.
statute is the statute. There'd be a perfect case, Assemblyman Montesano, of somebody that did have the evidence. I mean, the DNA is the best evidence. Of course, there's not always going to be cases like that. But it pains me to hear that we New Yorkers have to go to Massachusetts to get justice. Why aren't we the leaders? We're
In my
New
own
York.
community, a coach molested 2 young boys, and again, fortunately, he did it in Massachusetts, so that he was able to be tried in Massachusetts and received a sentence. In New York, he would have been time barred.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to the change in New York.
So am I.
Good for you.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Dr.
Thank you.
Cynthia Mercado, Associate Professor of Psychology at John Jay. Thank you for coming.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation. I'm an associate professor of psychology at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and my research centers generally on the establishing empirical evidence for sexual violence policy. My research is being funded by the National Institute of Justice as well as the U.S. Conference on Catholic Bishops, and has centers around looking at the causes and context of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, as well as establishing empirical evidence for broad sex offender policies such as residence restrictions. So given that I only have several minutes, I'm going to try to sum up directly what is known about the prevalence of sexual violence, the direct and indirect costs of sexual violence, as well as what is known about disclosure, and often the delays to disclosure of sexual abuse. To begin, child sexual abuse is a major public health problem. The number of children estimated to have been abused in the U.S. is many. David Finkelhor, the leading expert on the prevalence of sexual abuse, suggests that approximately 20% of females and some 5 to 10% of males have suffered sexual abuse during childhood. That is 1 in every 10 or 20 boys, and as many as 1 in every 5 females have been sexually abused, and most often at the hands of someone they know or with whom they are well acquainted and often live with. These numbers are, however, likely to be a serious underestimate, given that many cases of abuse go unreported. Indeed, estimates indicate that 25 to 40% of children never tell anyone of their abuse, and less than 20% of sexual abuse incidents result in an official report to police. Childhood sexual abuse, as you know, has both serious short and long-term impact upon its victims. Indeed, a history of abuse has been linked to emotional, psychological, physical, and even economic harm. Studies show that victims of abuse are at increased rates for psychopathology such as mood disorders, for example, depression, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, borderline personality disorder, and alcohol and substance abuse. Suicidal ideation, suicidal attempts, and self-harm are also more common among sexual abuse victims, as are sexual promiscuity and HIV and STD risk-taking behavior. The consequences of sexual abuse are not, however, limited to psychological sequelae. Victims of sexual abuse also have elevated rates of medical problems well into adulthood, including more frequent hospitalizations and incidents of physical illness. Additionally, there are social and economic consequences to sexual abuse during childhood, including elevated rates of unemployment, marital and relationship problems, and even higher rates of crime victimization. Finally, re-victimization is common, with those having been sexually abused being significantly more likely to be victimized again in adulthood. Women with a history of child sexual abuse are, in fact, 2 to 3 times more likely to be victimized in adulthood than are women with no such history of abuse. It is not unusual for victims to delay or fail to disclose sexual abuse. Many factors impact upon the decision to report sexual violence, including guilt, shame, the secrecy that surrounds the abuse, and fear of negative consequences. Research estimates indicate that among those who do disclose of their abuse, only 1/3 of those abused during childhood disclose before the age of 18, with some 2/3 waiting until adulthood to disclose of their abuse. It is not uncommon for reports of abuse to be made years, sometimes even decades, after the events occur. A recent study found, for example, the average age of disclosure to be 26 years, some 12 years after the time at which the abuse had ended. Low self-esteem, self-blame, anticipation of unsupportive reactions, and fear of social rejection are common among abuse victims. Many children wait until adulthood to disclose of their abuse, allowing time to process and understand what are in fact very incomprehensible and inconceivable events, and allowing them time to find appropriate and supportive persons who they trust sufficiently enough to make the disclosure to. Often children feel that they simply may not be believed. Indeed, one of the important factors in the decision to disclose is the perceived belief of the caretaker with regard to the veracity of the disclosure. Other factors have been found to influence the decision to disclose abuse, with relationship to the victim being one of the most important factors. Victims who are related to their perpetrators are among those least likely to report the abuse or to do so after a very long delay. Gender may also play a role in reporting, with research suggesting that abuse of males may be acutely underreported. And although results are equivocal, at least some research has found that severity of abuse may impact the decision to report, with more severe abuse being less likely to be reported. The costs of sexual violence are high. Although it is virtually impossible to calculate the precise economic impact of sexual abuse on society, it is clear that victimization is a serious public health problem with far-reaching consequences. Victims of childhood sexual abuse often have difficulty managing the myriad of emotions related to their abuse, and many continue to seek support services related to the abuse itself or its associated negative psychological, social, or medical sequelae well into adulthood. In summary, the research shows that childhood sexual abuse has serious and long-term impact upon its victims. Moreover, it can be safely assumed that official counts of abuse seriously underestimate its true prevalence. It is clear that the costs, although in many ways immeasurable, are many. Given clear evidence on the underreporting of abuse and typical delays to reporting, statutes that provide victims extra time to report sexual crimes will be responsive to the empirical reality of disclosure patterns, and importantly, represent a more victim-centered approach to addressing the serious problem of sexual violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So This is the time now for questions, believe it or not, even though we've asked a few. And I really have one about a subject that hasn't been addressed yet. And maybe it's for Dr. Miller